The narrative unfolds not with the thunder of battles or the flame of burning ships, but with an object far more innocuous, yet one that became the catalyst for grand events: a golden apple. This gleaming fruit, cast amidst a festive celebration, instantly transformed from a mere symbol into a legend, foreshadowing unprecedented upheaval. Audiences are invited to delve into an era when celestials walked the earth alongside mortals, when the destinies of powerful rulers were bound by unbreakable oaths, and when a single, seemingly insignificant decision could determine the outcome of a bloody, decade-long war. This was not the Hellenic world later renowned for its majestic temples and profound philosophers. No, this was an older, more mysterious mythical age, when the deeds of heroes cast incredibly long shadows, and the Olympian gods still shamelessly interfered in every step of humanity. Let this ancient story slowly reveal its secrets, beginning with that fateful moment when the gears of the Trojan War were set in motion. The starting point of the narrative will not be a blood-soaked battlefield, but a magnificent celebration, a wedding of truly divine proportions. This event demanded golden goblets overflowing with nectar, enchanting melodies from celestial harpists, and such an abundance of feasting delights that mortals, naturally, were forbidden entry. The setting for this extraordinary event was a space stretched somewhere between the bottomless heavens and the mysterious wine-dark sea. There the marriage of Peleus, a mortal king whose name was wreathed in glory, and Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty was incomparable and temperament utterly unpredictable, was celebrated. In one moment she could quell the wildest waves. In another she might transform into a fire-breathing lioness, demonstrating the full power and changeability of the watery element. Such creatures as sea nymphs are, at times, elusive and enigmatic in every sense of the word. This was a celebration far from the ordinary. The Olympian gods themselves were present: mighty Zeus, imperious Hera, wise Athena, golden-haired Apollo, and even Dionysus, who undoubtedly came for the exquisite wines and the inevitable drama. The reason for such an unusual union was an ancient prophecy. Thetis's child was destined to surpass his father. Naturally, the gods, being, in essence, the divine equivalent of power-hungry top-tier officials, unanimously decided that none of them wished to raise a demigod capable of someday overthrowing them. Therefore they resolved to marry Thetis to a mortal. The lucky man was Peleus, a sufficiently respected and valiant warrior who was likely too prudent to ask too many questions about such a generous gift of fate. It was at this moment, as the festivities reached their zenith, that the narrative takes a sharp turn, foreshadowing imminent disaster. The fact was, one very influential person was not invited to such a significant event. This was Eris, the goddess of discord, the embodiment of disagreement and all that brings confusion. She could be imagined as the divine personification of an incredibly ill-timed and destructive message sent to a group chat, capable of instantly sowing chaos. Deeply offended and seething with rage, Eris did what anyone in her position likely would have done. She arrived at the feast anyway, bringing with her an ominous gift, a golden apple, dazzlingly bright and perfectly beautiful, upon whose surface were engraved 3 concise but fateful words: "To the fairest." She tossed it directly into the centre of the banqueting hall, watching as a deathly silence instantly fell, and likely departed with a triumphant, satisfied smirk, anticipating the coming. discord, one might assume that the all-powerful Olympian gods would rise above such petty squabbles over a mere shiny fruit. However, no. Dignity departed the halls of the feast faster than Hermes rushing on his divine errands on a market day. Immediately 3 great goddesses laid claim to the golden apple: Hera, the majestic queen of Olympus; Athena, the wise goddess of war and strategic art; and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, captivating beauty, and all that complicates mortal and divine life. Each sincerely believed herself the rightful owner of this gift, and each, in her own way, was formidable and dangerous enough to make the others doubt their claims. Faced with this unprecedented celestial beauty contest, the Olympians did as many bureaucratic systems often do when confronted with a no-win scenario. They shifted the problem onto someone else's shoulders. Thus enters Paris, a prince of Troy, whose subsequent decisions eloquently testified that judiciousness was not his strong suit. However, at that moment, he was merely a simple shepherd on the sacred Mount Ida. He had been quietly removed from royal life due to an ominous prophecy that he would one day cause the downfall of Troy. Naturally, his family, seeking to avert disaster, decided to abandon the infant in the mountains, just in case. Nevertheless, Paris grew into a handsome and robust youth, and far more importantly for this story, utterly unprepared to judge a divine dispute. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris not in humble mortal attire, but in all their dazzling divine radiance, exuding unearthly majesty. Each offered him a bribe, attempting to sway him to a favorable decision. Hera promised him limitless power, offering dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered profound wisdom and undeniable victories in any battle. But Aphrodite, always unerringly sensing her audience, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the entire world. Paris, reasoning like a passionate youth rather than a far-sighted geopolitical strategist, unhesitatingly gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. And it was at this moment that the world began to slowly but surely descend into the flames of impending disaster. So who was this most beautiful woman in the world, whose love was promised to Paris? Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta, daughter of mighty Zeus and Leda, or, according to some traditions, the goddess Nemesis. Many Greek kings vied for her hand and heart, and once they nearly clashed in a deadly struggle over her unearthly beauty. To prevent an inevitable conflict, her mortal father, King Tyndareus, made all the suitors swear an oath that they would respect Helen's choice. Furthermore, they pledged to unite and retrieve her, should anyone ever dare to abduct her. This was an early premonition of the foreign policy nightmare that merely awaited its hour. Ultimately, Helen chose Menelaus, a capable, though somewhat modest, king of Sparta. They married, and, for a time, peace reigned in their lives. However, this tranquility was shattered when Paris arrived at the court under the pretext of a diplomatic mission, and then, incited by Aphrodite's intrigues, either seduced or abducted Helen, depending on which source one prefers. In Homer's epic Iliad, Helen appears weary, full of regrets, and a passive victim of circumstances. In Euripides' tragedies, her image is more assertive and active. Later poets go even further, claiming that Helen never even set foot on Trojan soil, and that only a phantom version of her resided in Troy, while the real queen remained in Egypt, like a slightly annoyed chess piece removed from the game. However, regardless of the chosen version of events, the outcome remained unchanged. Paris returned to Troy, leading Helen, and an enraged Menelaus immediately appealed to every king, prince, and warrior who had once sworn to protect his wife's honor. It is at this point that ancient myth begins to intertwine closely with historical realities. For centuries, scholars have hotly debated whether the Trojan War actually occurred. Was there truly a massive conflict between the mighty Mycenaean Greeks and a prosperous city on the Anatolian coast? Perhaps this city bore the name Wilusa, a name that bears a striking phonetic resemblance to Ilion, another name for Troy. Archaeological excavations conducted at Hisarlik, the presumed location of Troy, have revealed a city that was destroyed not once, but many times by fire and war. Bustling trade routes passed through this strategically important region, ensuring a constant flow of untold riches. It is only natural that wealth was followed by conflict. Thus, while the Olympian gods may not have hurled their spears directly from the peak of Olympus, someone undoubtedly threw something far more material over those ancient walls. And now, returning to the mythical fabric of the narrative, the Greeks began to gather their forces. Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae and brother of Menelaus, assumed supreme command of the united army. His leadership was driven less by universal love or charisma than by his possession of an impressive fleet, countless swords, and, of course, a very loud and persuasive voice. Other great kings and heroes answered his call: Odysseus, renowned for his cunning and resourceful mind; Nestor, the wise and talkative elder; Ajax, a mighty and silent warrior; and of course among them was Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the very couple whose wedding, ironically, became the initial spark that ignited this widespread conflict. Achilles was a prince whose name inspired awe, raised by the wise centaur Chiron, which, as is known, was common for many heroes of that era. He was trained to become the greatest warrior of his age, unsurpassed in strength and skill. His mother, Thetis, fearing for her son's life and foreseeing his early demise, dipped the infant in the waters of the sacred river Styx to make him invulnerable to any weapon. However, she held him by the heel, and this single spot remained unprotected. It is this myth that gave the world the term Achilles' heel, serving as a constant reminder that even the mightiest and most invincible beings have their vulnerabilities, sometimes literally embodied. However, not all heroes were equally eager to join the impending war. Odysseus, famed for his cunning mind and perpetual inventiveness, feigned madness to avoid separation from his young son. He yoked an ox and a donkey to a plough, then began sowing salt on his fertile fields, simulating complete insanity. This deception continued until one of the shrewd Greeks placed Odysseus's infant son directly in front of the plough. Without hesitation, Odysseus sharply swerved, thereby inadvertently proving his sanity, and was immediately sent to war. Achilles was also cleverly hidden, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. This ingenious plan held successfully until Odysseus, again demonstrating his shrewdness, brought trinkets and weapons to the island, laying them out before the gathered maidens. Achilles, obeying his true nature, naturally reached for the sword immediately, giving himself away. Boys will be boys, even when dressed as girls. So, a fleet of 1,000 ships, as legend has it, was assembled, and it seemed the winds were ready to fill the sails. But no, In the port of Aulis, the entire fleet found itself trapped in a dead calm, foreshadowing new trials. The Olympian gods, it turned out, were not so easily manipulated. Artemis, the mighty goddess of the hunt, was deeply offended, likely by Agamemnon himself, who either arrogantly boasted of his hunting prowess, or, even worse, killed a sacred deer dedicated to her. As a result of her indignation, she demanded a terrible price, the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, the young Iphigenia. This was one of those pivotal moments when Greek myth takes a sharp turn from lavish splendor to profound tragedy. Agamemnon, seized by agonizing doubts, hesitated for a long time. His hesitation was quite understandable, but in the end, ambition and the thirst for glory triumphed over paternal love. Iphigenia was lured to Aulis under the false pretext of marriage to the great Achilles, and there she was sacrificed. Some versions of this myth offer a more merciful outcome, claiming that Artemis at the last moment carried the girl away, leaving a deer on the altar. However, most traditions, frankly, narrate the terrible truth. Agamemnon personally killed his daughter, and only after this did the winds begin to blow, filling the sails. This was a grim, ominous beginning to an even grimmer war, and so as divine enmity reached its peak, ancient oaths were called to be fulfilled, and personal tragedies multiplied. 1,000 ships set sail for the shores of Troy. None of the brave warriors could have foreseen that they would remain there for a full 10 years, paying for their pride and thirst for revenge. And even fewer knew that by the time this grand siege ended, almost all of them would be dead, disgraced, or doomed to eternal wandering across the seas. However, that narrative is for the next chapter. For now, we are left to ponder that even the greatest war in myths began not with the clang of swords, but with a lavish wedding, a deep insult, and a single golden apple. From the divine chaos caused by golden apples and the intrigues of goddesses, the narrative smoothly transitions to the figure of a woman who, according to some, launched 1,000 ships. Perhaps this is a slight exaggeration, as poets were never overly restrained in their descriptions, but it is fair to say that Helen of Sparta, later of Troy, found herself at the very epicenter of the gathering storm, her fate inextricably linked with that of entire nations. The story of Helen unfolds even before her birth, which in itself foreshadows a series of extraordinary and unsettling events. Her mother, Leda, occupied the throne of Sparta. One day, in the full light of day, Zeus, known for his tireless passion among the Olympian gods, cast his gaze upon Leda from the heights of Olympus. He decided, as often happened in his numerous escapades, to seduce her. However, instead of appearing before her in his true divine radiance, sometimes accompanied by flashes of lightning, the supreme God chose the form of a swan, a choice that certainly matched his unpredictable nature. The result of this unusual union, according to various mythological traditions, was either one or several eggs laid by Leda. As is often the case in ancient myths, they demonstrate a striking adherence to the extraordinary and only a superficial interest in matters of mundane plausibility. It was from these astonishing eggs that Helen was born. In some versions of the myth, her brothers, Castor and Pollux, were also born with her, as was her sister Clytemnestra, who was destined to play a significant role in the coming upheavals that engulfed Hellas. But for now, young Helen enjoyed the privileges of royal life, surrounded by untold luxury. From her earliest years she was perceived as a true marvel. Her allure transcended the usual human concept of beauty. Legends say she possessed a divine, unearthly beauty. It was such splendor that men involuntarily froze in admiration. Women whispered. Consumed by envy or astonishment, and powerful kings lost their composure, committing rash acts. When Helen reached maturity, almost every noble and valiant man of the Hellenic world sought to win her favor. Among her suitors were distinguished warriors, hereditary princes, and powerful kings, such as the cunning Odysseus, the valiant Ajax, and the influential Menelaus. Their number was so vast that Tyndareus, her mortal father, reasonably feared that no matter his choice, the other contenders would inevitably feel insulted, which, in turn, could provoke a large-scale war, and quite likely lead to destruction in its wake. For this reason, following the wise counsel of Odysseus, known for his strategic mind, Tyndareus obliged all suitors to swear a sacred oath, known as the Oath of Tyndareus. According to this oath, each of them had to unconditionally accept Helen's choice and, more importantly, stand in defense of her future husband if anyone ever attempted to abduct her from him. This was truly a brilliant solution, yet it, as often happens with the most well-laid plans in Greek myths, was destined to turn into a catastrophic failure. Ultimately, Helen chose Menelaus, brother of the powerful Agamemnon and future ruler of Sparta. Menelaus was a capable man, possessed considerable wealth, and enjoyed universal respect. He wasn't particularly charismatic, but he couldn't be ignored either. He could be compared to a man who meticulously polishes his armor and tacitly expects others to notice. Helen and Menelaus married, and for some time their lives proceeded smoothly. They had a daughter named Hermione, settled into a luxurious Spartan palace, and ruled their prosperous kingdom in an atmosphere of peace and tranquility. And then came the arrival of Paris. This young man, son of Priam and Hecuba of Troy, was raised not as an heir apparent, but as an ordinary shepherd. This is a common motif in myths, where a hero's birth is overshadowed by an ominous prophecy. In Paris's case, the prediction was very specific and terrifying. He was destined to cause the downfall of Troy. Naturally, his royal parents did what they believed any responsible monarchs would do. They abandoned the infant in the wilderness. However, to their misfortune, Paris survived. Raised among shepherds, he grew into a man of extraordinary beauty, yet possessed a rather limited worldview. He was eventually readmitted to the royal family. The prophecy, apparently, was forgotten in the hustle and bustle of court life. Soon after, he was dispatched on a diplomatic mission to Greece, officially to foster friendly relations, but unofficially to cause significant unrest. Upon Paris's arrival in Sparta, Menelaus extended a warm welcome, demonstrating hospitality according to all Greek customs, which usually implied abundant food and wine, and no attempt to take the guest's life. However, Menelaus was soon forced to depart for a funeral ceremony. Paris, always prone to exploiting any opportunity, and under the powerful influence of Aphrodite, who had promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, did not fail to take advantage of the king's absence. The question of whether Helen was a willing accomplice or a victim of divine intervention remains one of the greatest mysteries of ancient myths. Homer's Iliad portrays her as a woman torn by internal contradictions, experiencing shame and prone to contemplation but not overtly coerced. Later tragedians such as Euripides endowed her with more or less free will, depending on the dramatic intent. Some versions, for example, in Euripides' play Helen, go so far as to assert that she never even went to Troy at all. They say that Paris abducted only her phantom image, while the real Helen remained in Egypt, just as bewildered by the events as everyone else. However, the most widespread version states that Helen departed with Paris, crossed the Aegean Sea, and arrived in Troy, leaving behind her husband, her child, and, even more importantly, that sacred oath that bound all her former suitors. When Menelaus returned to find not only his wife missing, but his honor publicly trampled, he did not give himself over to silent grief. Instead, he immediately invoked the sacred oath. Messengers were dispatched throughout Hellas, and kings from all corners of the land were called to arms. Ancient alliances, seemingly long forgotten, reawakened. Even those who had long retired and started new lives now found themselves firmly bound by a sacred promise once given. And what a gathering of distinguished heroes it was, united. Command of the combined forces was assumed by Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae. He was known as an ambitious, proud man, unafraid to make great sacrifices, even of his own daughter, when the gods refused to grant favorable winds. But that story has already been told. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, tried his best to stay out of this endeavor. He had a young son, Telemachus, a wise wife, Penelope, and no desire to participate in distant overseas adventures. For this reason he feigned madness, ploughing his fields and sowing them with salt. However, when Greek envoys cunningly placed his infant son, Telemachus, directly in front of the plough, Odysseus instantly swerved, thereby proving his sanity and, alas, sealing his fate. Achilles, considered the greatest warrior of his century, was also reluctant to go to war. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, had prudently hidden her son on the island of Skyros, disguising him in women's clothing and placing him among the daughters of King Lycomedes. The reason was simple and tragic. It had been prophesied that if Achilles went to fight, he would never return home. But here again Odysseus showed his ingenuity. He laid out various gifts before the girls: elegant combs, sparkling bracelets, polished mirrors, and, among everything else, a single sword. Achilles, following his true nature, unhesitatingly chose the weapon. It was a predictable but extremely effective method of exposure. Over time, a truly formidable army gathered under Agamemnon's command. Countless ships were prepared, legends speak of 1,000 vessels, and the greatest military force ever seen by the Hellenic world, united under his banner. However, before setting sail, the Greeks needed a favorable omen, for they took divine signs with exceptional seriousness. The gods did not send written messages, but they sent birds and other signs. At Aulis, the gathering place, a huge snake appeared, devouring 9 sparrows before everyone's eyes, and then turning to stone itself. The seer Calchas interpreted this as a sign that the war would last a long 9 years, and Troy would fall only in the 10th year. It's easy to imagine that this prediction somewhat dampened the spirits of the assembled warriors. Nevertheless, the Greeks, despite everything, began their massive expedition. However, the path to Troy was not so direct. First, the Greek forces mistakenly attacked Teufrania, a city in Mysia, which, to their misfortune, greatly resembled their true target. Geography, it turned out, was not among the Hellenes' strong suits. Eventually, they did reach Troy and established their camp along the shores just outside the mighty city walls. These defensive structures, according to ancient myths, were built by Apollo and Poseidon themselves, when the gods, disguised as mortals, were temporarily punished to serve King Laomedon. Thus, these walls were, to say the least, impregnable. It became evident that this war would not be swift. Inside Troy, Helen was received not as a captive, but rather as a full-fledged queen. Priam, the aging ruler of the city, treated her with exceptional kindness. His son, Hector, considered Troy's greatest warrior, treated her courteously, though he did not hide his disapproval. The city, with all its splendor and power, gradually became a golden cage for Helen. She was now a symbol of a conflict over which she had very little power, and yet she was equally adored and blamed. Meanwhile, the military operations evolved into an exhausting and protracted stalemate. A series of raids, fierce skirmishes, and diplomatic missions ensued, bringing no peace. Great heroes rose and fell in battle, and throughout it all, Helen remained at the epicenter of events, not participating in the fighting, but observing it. Her story presents a profound paradox. She simultaneously acts as victim and agent, loved and hated in equal measure, and remembered not for her actions but rather for her presence, her role as the very prize for which the greatest warriors bled and died. And what of Helen herself? Well, myths, as is often the case, do not provide unequivocal answers. Some traditions claim she first loved Paris, then hated him. Others say she pitied Menelaus, then despised him. In one version, after the fall of Troy, she returns to Sparta with her husband, who magnanimously forgives her. In another, she dies at the hands of Menelaus's mother, strangled in a fit of righteous anger. Poets never agreed on her fate or true nature. She was too beautiful to be evil, but too dangerous to be good. Perhaps she was the embodiment of war itself, irrational, unjust, but utterly inevitable. Thus, with Helen in Troy, Menelaus raging, and every king in Greece clamouring for retribution, the stage was fully set for the coming events. Full-scale hostilities had not yet begun, but the fuse was lit. Troy's mighty walls still stood tall, yet every god, every mortal, and every poet already knew their impregnability would not last forever. For now, it seemed, one could take a breath. The storm was gathering, but there was still time before swords would sing in their deadly dance. It seems truly strange, the process of preparing for a war that has not yet begun. Swords are still sheathed, ships not yet launched, yet the decisions made in these tense moments, quiet but stubborn, resound no less loudly than future battle cries. And so the gaze turns once more to Greece, where ancient alliances are invoked, oaths remembered with almost theatrical gravity, and kings emerge from the shadows of their own ambitions, ready for great deeds. The Hellenes, or more accurately, the Achaeans, were not a unified nation, but rather a loose confederation of fiercely independent city-states. Each possessed its own ruler, unique customs, dialects, and, notably, an insurmountable sense of its own superiority. To unite them was akin to herding wild cats, large, bronze-clad, and exceedingly arrogant ones at that. Yet, somehow, Agamemnon was the one who undertook this task. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was not universally beloved. He possessed the charisma of wet marble and the diplomatic finesse of a battering ram. But he had ships, and in Bronze Age Greece, that circumstance was paramount. Furthermore, he was Menelaus's brother, whose wife Helen had just run off with a Trojan prince, or been abducted, depending on whom you asked. In any case, Agamemnon felt it his duty to assist and, not coincidentally, to solidify his own power in the process. Before we embark on this grand narrative, let us first acquaint ourselves with the key figures whose fates intertwined in the crucible of this great war. Among them were names that echoed on battlefields and were etched into the immortal lines of epic poems. Among them stood Odysseus, king of Ithaca, known for his cunning, sardonic wit, and exceptional intellect. His soul gravitated more towards peaceful farming than bloody battles. When the call to arms came, Odysseus attempted to evade military service by feigning madness. He yoked an ass and an ox to a single plough, then began to sow salt on his fields. However, to his misfortune, the Greeks called upon a man named Palamedes, who proved even more perceptive. Palamedes, without hesitation, placed the infant Telemachus, Odysseus's son, directly in front of the plough. Odysseus sharply swerved, and his pretense was exposed. He went to war, but his heart was filled with resentment. Next came Achilles, son of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph known for her dramatic disappearances. Achilles was raised by the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him medicine, music, hunting, and most importantly, the art of elegant killing. Thetis received a prophecy. Her son would either live a long, peaceful life and be forgotten, or die young in glory and be remembered forever. She, for perfectly understandable reasons, preferred the former. So she hid Achilles on the island of Skyros, disguising him as a girl. It's unclear how convincingly he played the role, but he lived among the daughters of King Lycomedes, perhaps hoping that history would simply pass him by. History, of course, never forgets Achilles. Odysseus was sent to find him. Knowing that no warrior could resist the call of glory or the clang of bronze weapons, he laid out gifts before the maidens, elegant garments, trinkets, and a single gleaming sword. Achilles, as expected, reached for the sword. A trumpet sounded, and the deception crumbled. Achilles, his true identity now revealed, was promised honor, spoils, and eternal glory. He agreed. He also brought along his loyal companion Patroclus, who would become as crucial to this war as any sword or shield. Other heroes joined them. Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, was a mighty brute, strong as an ox and about as eloquent. Diomedes, the young king of Argos, was renowned for his ferocity and surprising reverence for the gods. Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, spoke mostly in long, winding stories of how everything was better in his youth, and somehow made everyone listen. And finally, Calchas, the seer, who claimed to read the will of the gods by studying the flight of birds, the livers of sacrificed animals, and, one suspects, the subtle art of educated guesswork. Altogether, they gathered their men, their ships, and their supplies at the port of Aulis, a windswept harbour on the eastern coast of Boeotia. It was here, as legend has it, that the entire Greek fleet assembled. 1,000 ships, if Homer is to be believed. It's a lovely round number, though deeply impractical, But myth was never built on practicality. And then nothing happened. The ships were ready, the men waited restlessly. The gods, however, remained silent. Not a breeze stirred the sails. The sea lay flat, like a philosopher's expression. The calm was so complete it felt like divine punishment. And indeed, that's precisely what it was. The fact was, Agamemnon had made a fatal error. While hunting, he had killed a sacred deer, an animal beloved by Artemis, goddess of the hunt, protector of virgins, and not one to take insults lightly. As if that weren't enough, he allegedly boasted that he was the better hunter, which, one can imagine, was the mythological equivalent of poking a sleeping bear with a borrowed spear. So Artemis refused to let the winds blow. The ships would remain trapped in Aulis unless Agamemnon atoned. And by atoned, she meant the sacrifice of his daughter, Iphigenia. This, needless to say, was not met with approval. Agamemnon hesitated, understandably so. But in the end, ambition triumphed over paternal love. He sent word to his wife Clytemnestra that their daughter was to marry Achilles. A lie, of course, a deadly one. Iphigenia arrived excited, perhaps even blushing, and was led to the altar. Some stories say she was slain. Others claim that Artemis, in a rare act of mercy, spirited her away at the last moment and replaced her with a deer. Either way, the deed was done. The winds returned, the sails billowed, and the Greek fleet finally set off across the Aegean Sea. But their first stop was not Troy. In one of those awkward footnotes that history tends to skip, they accidentally landed in Mysia, a city that, unfortunately, resembled Troy quite a bit. Ancient navigation, it turned out, was more art than science. They attacked. The ruler of that place, Telephus, was wounded by Achilles and fled. Later, ironically, he was healed by Achilles with the very spear that had pierced him. The Greeks, it seems, could be both destructive and helpful, sometimes in the same breath. Eventually, the fleet reached the shores of Troy, a city on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. The Trojans watched from their walls as the horizon filled with black sails, and they prepared. Let us pause here to consider what the city of Troy might have been like. The archaeological site known today as Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey shows layer upon layer of cities built and destroyed over centuries. One of these layers, Troy 6 or 7, shows signs of fire, war, and sudden destruction. There are defensive walls, storage jars, and evidence of trade with the Mycenaean world. Whether this was Homer's Troy, we may never know for sure, but the echoes are there. The Trojans, too, had their heroes. Priam, the old king, wise and weary, ruled from the citadel. His wife, Hecuba, kept a stern court. They had many sons, but the most renowned was Hector, the protector of Troy, a prince, a husband, a father, and a man who fought not for glory, but for duty. Beside him stood Aeneas, a noble warrior, supposedly the son of Aphrodite herself, whose lineage would one day lead, as Virgil claimed, to the founding of Rome. And of course there was Paris, the younger son, less noble, more complex. Paris, as you may recall, had been granted Helen by the gods. He was handsome, charming, and utterly unprepared for the consequences of his decisions. In Homer's Iliad, Paris is not evil or cruel. He is simply agonizingly aware that he is not built for battlefield glory. He is a man who started a war with a kiss, and then spent much of it trying to evade the repercussions. The quiet echo of Troy, 10 years of war and fate. Helen, whose name had become synonymous with tragedy, now resided in the upper chambers of the magnificent palace. Her presence divided opinions in Troy into two irreconcilable camps. Some, captivated by her ethereal grace, refined manners, and almost supernatural beauty, admired her immensely. Others, possessing a more pragmatic mindset and less prone to enchantment, unreservedly blamed her for the war that had erupted. One can imagine her hearing whispers through the pages of the Iliad. She appears as a figure both self-aware and self-reproaching. "Oh, would that I had died before I followed your son here," she bitterly addresses Priam. Yet, despite these torments, she remains, and the war, meanwhile, escalates. The conflict did not begin with the collapse of towers, but with a series of devastating raids. The Greeks, faced with the impregnability of the Trojan walls, were forced to resort to attacking Troy's allies, cities located along the coast. They seized provisions, enslaved women, and set fire to everything they couldn't carry away. It was this repetitive cycle, campaign, retreat, rest, that defined the character of the first 9 years of the war. During one such raid, the Greeks captured 2 women whose names would later become the cause of the greatest catastrophe. One was Chryseis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo, who was given to Agamemnon. The other was Briseis, destined for Achilles. These women were not merely spoils of war in the traditional sense of trophies. They were grimly taken as concubines. And the gods, it turned out, were watching closely. When Chryseis' father, full of despair, pleaded for her return, and Agamemnon arrogantly refused Apollo, god of plague. Archery and at times unexpected poetic justice unleashed a pestilence upon the Greek camp. Soldiers began to die, animals perished, the air filled with stench. Eventually Agamemnon yielded, though not without drama. He returned Chryseis to her father, but as compensation demanded Briseis from Achilles. This, to put it mildly, was a fatal mistake. Achilles, already burning with pride, completely withdrew from the war. He refused to fight, refused to speak. He even avoided looking at Agamemnon save for sidelong glances. The mightiest Greek warrior had now retreated, sulking, as some said, but in truth deeply wounded. In the heroic code, honor was valued above any armor. To be publicly disgraced was not merely an insult, it was something soul-shattering. The morale of the Greeks wavered. They continued their assault on the city, but without Achilles their strength was depleted. Hector, on the other hand, surged forward, rallying the Trojan forces and driving the Greeks back to their ships. Fierce skirmishes erupted, chariots thundered, shields cracked, but the walls of Troy still stood inviolable. However, let us step back for a moment and imagine what this war actually looked like. Not in poetic rendition, but in the harsh realities of the Bronze Age. This was not trench warfare, not mass armies of unified soldiers. These were chariots, short swords and throwing spears. Bronze, not iron. Armor was heavy and unique to each warrior. Battles were small and often consisted of duels between champions, watched by spectators. Imagine rugby, but with much more stabbing. The war was also deeply ritualized. Before battle, warriors would deliver speeches, sometimes addressing their enemies, boasting of lineage, deeds, and divine favor. After the fighting, they would strip the dead of their armor and weapons, which were both valuable and symbolic. And yet, amidst the stylized duels and epic speeches, there was real loss. Entire cities were destroyed. Sons never returned home. Women became slaves. Songs remembered heroes, but silence belonged to the nameless dead. The Iliad, spanning just a few weeks in the 10th year of the war, gives us a unique window into this moment of stagnation and profound grief. It is during this time that we meet the entire cast of characters. Ajax the Great, wielding a massive shield like a moving wall. Diomedes, who in the heat of battle wounds even Ares. Nestor, the elder statesman, offering advice so verbose it probably outlasted some battles. And of course, the gods. Ah yes, the gods. They were not neutral observers. They took sides, quarrelled, schemed, and sometimes even joined the fray themselves. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon favoured the Greeks. Apollo, Aphrodite, and Ares sided with the Trojans. Zeus, nominally neutral, mostly tried to maintain order and failed spectacularly. The gods squabbled no less than mortals. One might even say, more so. They threw divine tantrums, manipulated destinies, and sometimes disguised themselves as ordinary soldiers just to interfere. Indeed, the Olympians were the original micromanagers. Meanwhile, on Earth, the war continued. The Greeks, desperately needing Achilles, attempted diplomacy. They sent an embassy to his tent. Odysseus, Phoenix, and Ajax came with offers of treasure, apologies, and even the return of Briseis. But Achilles, sitting in his tent, refused, not out of whim, but out of principle. His honour had been trampled, and in the world of heroic warriors, honour was life itself. To be publicly disgraced was not merely an insult, it was soul-shattering. Nevertheless, even Achilles could not ignore what followed. Hector, bold and commanding, led a major Trojan offensive. He drove the Greeks back to their ships. Fires began to spread. For a moment it seemed Troy might win, not by cunning or strength, but by sheer persistence. This is the moment when the war turned inward, the moment when the greatest heroes on both sides stood on the brink, not yet clashing, but fully revealed. For now, the Greeks dug in. The Trojans advanced, and Helen watched from the walls, her fate and the fate of all others still unwritten. The siege had begun. The walls stood high, but something deeper was starting to crumble. Trust, pride, and the thin threads that bound kings to kings. And so the 10th year dawned, Achilles silent, Agamemnon humbled, and Hector ascendant. For now, rest easy, the ships are still at anchor, the fires still smouldering, and the gods have not yet cast their final lots. When people imagine the Trojan War, they often picture a continuous roar of battle, flashing swords, shouting heroes, gods hurling lightning from the sky. But the truth, if such a thing exists in mythology, is somewhat less cinematic and far slower. Because for 9 long years, this war dragged on in that grim, grinding manner that would test the patience of even the most enthusiastic poet. The siege was not constant fighting, but attrition, raids, starvation, disease, and the occasional divine tantrum. And perhaps this is why the Trojan War endures, not just because of the final blow, the horse, the fire, the fall, but because it reflects something very human, a grand idea that once set in motion, no one can stop, a war fought for honor which slowly becomes anything but. Back to the beach. The Greeks had established a camp along the shoreline, sprawling like a market left too long in the sun. Their ships were pulled ashore and fortified behind a wall of stakes and ditches. They had everything needed for a short war, which naturally meant they were unprepared for a long one. Troy's mighty walls held firm, and the Trojans rarely ventured beyond them. Every attempt to storm the city ended in blood and frustration, and so for much of those 9 years, the Greeks did what they could. They raided the surrounding countryside. They plundered cities loyal to Troy, seizing food, livestock, gold, and, most tragically, women. These women were taken as concubines, slaves, bargaining chips. War, for all its heroic verses, was also brutally transactional. This is how Briseis and Chryseis entered the story. 2 women, caught in the tide of war, given to men as prizes, and ultimately used to ignite the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles that we have already discussed. But the cracks were deeper than one quarrel. Beneath the polished speeches and bronze breastplates, the Greek coalition began to fray. Agamemnon's leadership, while militarily sound, was unpopular. He had a knack for taking more than his share and offering less than deserved. Kings like Odysseus, Diomedes, and Ajax often found themselves balancing obedience with their own ambitions and growing exasperation. Achilles, for his part, had completely withdrawn from the war. His pride was wounded, his honor insulted. He refused to fight. For much of these years he remained in his tent, sharpening his weapons, playing his lyre, and generally being a brooding icon of Bronze Age masculinity. Meanwhile, the Trojans were not idle. While the Greeks ravaged the countryside, the Trojans forged new alliances. Reinforcements arrived from neighboring kingdoms, Lycian, Phrygian, and others whose names have been lost to time. Among them was a warrior named Sarpedon, son of Zeus, who fought with a quiet dignity that would later inspire even his enemies. Inside Troy, tensions mounted. The people suffered. Food became scarce. Supplies from the interior were disrupted by Greek patrols, yet the walls held, a symbol of resilience against overwhelming odds. As the war dragged on, both sides increasingly relied on divine favor, or at least the illusion of it. The Greeks offered sacrifices to Athena, Hera, and Poseidon. The Trojans invoked Apollo, Aphrodite, and Artemis. The gods, it must be said, behaved much like mortals, squabbling, sulking, playing favorites, and sometimes, in the guise of ordinary soldiers, stepping onto the battlefield. Ancient tales passed down orally recount a duel between Menelaus and Paris that took place at the dawn of the Trojan War. The plan was utterly simple: resolve the conflict through single combat. One duel, one outcome. This would avoid mass bloodshed and mournful farewells. The battle was set. Menelaus, naturally consumed by righteous indignation, fought with a fury born of offended honor. Paris, possessing less martial prowess and a greater inclination for elegance, swiftly found himself at a disadvantage. At the moment Menelaus prepared to deliver the decisive blow, Aphrodite suddenly intervened, instantly whisking Paris away from the battlefield and teleporting him directly to his private chambers, to Helen, who by this point had grown weary of such farces and pointless dramas. It's worth noting that Aphrodite acted without the slightest request for anyone's approval. She simply decided, like a protective mother, that her beloved son had endured enough trials. Menelaus, meanwhile, stood in the dust, his sword still raised, his eyes reflecting profound bewilderment at what had transpired. The war, it seemed, would not be resolved through valiant combat or adherence to martial honour. There were, of course, episodes of true heroism and valour. One of the most outstanding figures of this intermediate stage of the conflict was Diomedes, king of Argos, who fought with such ruthless determination and skill that he attracted the attention of even the heavens. At one point, Diomedes, with the help of the goddess Athena, who temporarily endowed him with the ability to discern divine beings on the battlefield, wounded Aphrodite herself. Yes, a mere mortal dared to shed divine blood. For her, it was, frankly, an undoubtedly humiliating incident. She fled in a panic to Olympus, bleeding and crying piteously, and Zeus delicately pointed out that perhaps war was not the best arena for one whose primary power lay in love charms rather than martial prowess. Later, Diomedes even struck Ares, the god of war. Ares, in turn, did what all warriors fear most. He complained to his almighty father. Zeus, showing no admiration, ordered him to cease the theatrical display and return to his duties. These episodes, though curious, speak to much deeper trends. The war had become such a complex and arduous epic that the lines between the divine and human worlds began to blur. The gods were no longer merely detached, silent observers. They found themselves literally in the thick of events, showing grievances, weaving intrigues, and even shedding blood. And yet, even as heroes fell one after another and cities turned to ash, the war stubbornly refused to leave the stage. Like an uninvited guest at a feast, it dragged on, exceeding all bounds of hospitality. In the Greek camp, Achilles still remained aloof from the fighting, and this decision continued to exact an exorbitant price from the Greeks. Without his participation, martial spirit steadily declined. Hector led increasingly daring and decisive attacks. The number of Greek casualties inexorably increased. Even Odysseus found it increasingly difficult to maintain discipline and combat readiness in the ranks, though he made every possible effort, sometimes resorting to cunning tricks, sometimes to the solace of wine. It was in this atmosphere of moral decay and general distrust that the seeds of betrayal took root. You may recall Palamedes, the ingenious man who once exposed Odysseus's feigned madness at the beginning of the war. Well, Odysseus, always thinking strategically and never forgiving slights, never forgot. According to later traditions, Odysseus fabricated an accusation of treason against Palamedes, forging a compromising letter and planting gold to create the impression that he was taking bribes from the Trojans. The Greeks, perhaps too desperately seeking a scapegoat, immediately put him to death. The loss of one of the most outstanding minds among them was a stark testament to the true cost of war. It consumed not only lives but also trust, not only cities but also virtue. The longer this bloody confrontation lasted, the more it demanded sacrifices, not only valiant heroes but also their humanity. And the Greeks, once united by a noble oath, began to show an increasingly deep rift. Agamemnon's arrogance caused increasing irritation. Achilles' oppressive silence hung in the air. Even Nestor's endless tales were perceived no longer as wisdom, but as a wearisome murmur. And what of Helen? She still watched from the walls. Her beauty, undiminished by time, had become a symbol. a kind of living banner of the conflict. For the Greeks, she embodied what had been treacherously stolen. For the Trojans, what they steadfastly refused to return. And for Helen herself, she found herself trapped between myth and reality, between love and hate. In the Iliad, she speaks of her own regret, calling herself a dog, a word full of shame, and asking if she had been cursed. One might wonder if she, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, grasped the true essence of this war, not an epic saga of glory, but a slowly unfolding tragedy. Thus, the 9th year of the great confrontation was drawing to a close. The Greeks, exhausted and fragmented, still clung to the coastline. The Trojans, worn out and virtually isolated, still held the city. The gods, licking their wounds, both physical and those to their pride, still intervened as they pleased. And Achilles, he still sat in his tent, silent, consumed by rage, unyielding, neither to Agamemnon's demands, nor to the harsh realities of war, nor even to fate itself. Yet harbingers of change already hung in the air. For in the heart of the Greek camp, a young man named Patroclus watched the flickering fires. And soon, very soon, that fire was to blaze with a new, destructive force. If the very concept of war could have a heartbeat, it would not be the clang of bronze weapons or the thunder of chariots. It would be more like a held breath between a deed accomplished and its inevitable consequence, an ominous silence preceding truly terrible events. And now we approach the very heart of the epic narrative of the Iliad, not its genesis and not its ultimate conclusion, but a unique time frame spanning a few days in the 10th year of the war, where the arrogance of a single man was to change the entire course of events. His name, of course, is Achilles, son of the mortal king Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, who held the threads of his destiny firmly in her hands. Achilles grew up aware of his exceptionalism and destiny. It was said that 2 paths lay before him, a long but obscure life, or a short but glorious path, whose echo would resound through the ages. He chose the eternal echo. However, few warn that glory itself is rarely as radiant in the process of its attainment. Often it is accompanied by loneliness, causes irritation, and is surrounded by those who are unable to comprehend its true nature. At the dawn of the events described, Achilles remains aloof from the fighting. His conflict with Agamemnon, caused by a dispute over the captive Briseis, plunged him into such profound and legendary melancholy that it occupies a central place in the first book of Homer's Iliad. However, to call this merely sulkiness would be to miss the full depth of what was happening. Achilles was not simply expressing discontent or being petulant. He had been publicly humiliated. In a warrior society where honor was valued no less than life itself, Agamemnon had infringed upon both. You see, when Agamemnon was forced to return Chryseis to end the plague sent by Apollo, he decided to take Briseis from Achilles as a kind of compensation, as if an exchange of captives could serve as a tool to maintain martial spirit. In doing so, he grossly violated the unwritten code of honor accepted among heroes. A warrior's spoils, however questionable their acquisition, embodied his dignity. Agamemnon might as well have taken Achilles' shield and demonstratively desecrated it. Achilles' response was not furious violence, which was astonishing in itself, but a deliberate withdrawal. He retreated to his tent, refusing to participate in battle or even to negotiate with Agamemnon. And while he indulged in his gloomy reflections, The course of the war outside his sanctuary began to change inexorably. Deprived of Achilles' presence, the Greeks faced an increased onslaught from the Trojans, who rushed into battle with renewed vigor. Hector, distinguished by his valor and sense of duty, led attack after attack. The Greeks, caught between incompetent command and active divine intervention, began to retreat. Individual skirmishes escalated into a full-scale, disorderly retreat. Even the mighty Ajax was forced to fall back under enemy pressure. At one point, the Trojans reached the Greek ships themselves, the very beachhead the Achaeans had held for nearly a decade. Achilles, however, watched from the sidelines, remaining motionless. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of the Iliad is that the defining action of its greatest hero is precisely inaction. For many pages he sits, consumed by rage, not from a lack of courage, but from a principled refusal to give Agamemnon the satisfaction of his return to battle. This can be seen as a vivid lesson in how dangerous pride is when intertwined with principles, or perhaps how easily the gods can break even the most outstanding individuals. Meanwhile, Agamemnon, uncharacteristically, began to panic. The belated realization that the sidelining of their best warrior had catastrophic consequences prompted him to offer Achilles a rich ransom, untold treasures, thoroughbred horses, entire cities, and even the return of Briseis untouched, as if Achilles should now be grateful for it. He even swore an oath, which was rare for Agamemnon, unless he was swearing to himself in a mirror. The embassy sent to deliver these belated apologies was composed of the most influential and eloquent Greek leaders. Among them were Odysseus, known for his unwavering eloquence, Ajax, always embodying unwavering strength, and Phoenix, Achilles' old mentor. Phoenix was sent in the hope that paternal affection could succeed where dry politics had failed. And so, at last, they entered Achilles' tent. There they found the hero gently plucking the strings of a lyre, not clad in battle armor, but immersed in the world of music. This served as a reminder, perhaps, that even the greatest warriors have a deep inner life. The envoys presented their arguments, appeals to glory, honor, and the pressing needs of all Greece. And Achilles replied with a categorical no, but not with blazing fury, but with a deep, calm conviction. In his speech he spoke of the futility of war, of the insults inflicted by Agamemnon, and of how no amount of gold could atone for lost pride. He even dared to question the heroic code itself. Why should he die for a man who treats him with contempt? What is the value of glory if it is won at the cost of one's own life? It is at this moment that Achilles transforms from a mere warrior into something more. He becomes the embodiment of a great question. What is the true price of heroism if it condemns one to suffer at the hands of fools? What is the value of victory if one must lose oneself to achieve it? And he refused. The embassy returned empty-handed, and the war, meanwhile, became even bloodier. When the Greek camp was already engulfed in flames and the Trojans had grown emboldened to the extreme, Patroclus stepped forward. Ah, yes, Patroclus, the loyal friend, the trusted comrade, the brother in arms, and according to some, even more. In the Homeric world, the precise nature of their relationship takes a back seat to their profound emotional significance. Patroclus was, in essence, Achilles' heart, beating outside his own body, and he could no longer stand idly by as his fellow Greeks perished. He pleaded with Achilles, "Allow me to enter the battle in your stead. let me don your armor. Let the Trojans believe that you have returned. Perhaps then they will retreat." Achilles gave his consent, but with a single condition: only to drive the enemy back from the ships, not to pursue them to the city gates. Patroclus donned the gleaming armor, forged by the gods, unmistakably recognized as Achilles' own, and led the Myrmidons into battle. And this daring plan worked. With the news of Achilles' return, the Trojan warriors were seized with panic. Patroclus, clad in the great hero's armor, fought with ferocious skill, a rage bordering on recklessness. He mercilessly struck down one opponent after another, and among the fallen was even mighty Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself. This event caused such profound grief that even the Olympian gods began to debate the wisdom of their intervention. However, swept up in the fervor of battle, Patroclus forgot his promise. He drove the Trojans all the way to the city walls of Troy, where he encountered Hector. The two great warriors clashed, spear against sword, valiant prince against hero. Ultimately, Hector delivered the fatal blow to Patroclus, unaware of his identity, until the helmet fell from the fallen man's head. Patroclus's death was a shock not only to Achilles, but to the Greek warriors, to the Trojans, and even to the gods. But no one felt it as deeply as Achilles. Upon hearing the terrible news, Achilles collapsed, overcome with immeasurable grief. He wept inconsolably, tore at his hair, covered himself in ashes, and lay in the dust. His former pride, his stubborn refusal to fight, his rage, all of it turned inward, tormenting his soul. And then it erupted. Thus began the wrath of Achilles. It was beautiful in its destructive power, terrifying in its mercilessness, and utterly unstoppable. First he went to seek new armor, as his previous set now adorned the body of the fallen Patroclus. Thetis, his divine mother, rose from the depths of the sea and hastened to Hephaestus, the divine smith, who forged a completely new set for Achilles. The armor was so skillfully crafted that it shone with blinding light. The shield was so vast that it depicted the entire cosmos. This was not just armor, it was fate itself, clad in magnificent raiment. Then Achilles returned to the battlefield. The Greeks, seeing his return, rejoiced, filled with new hope. The Trojans, seeing him, trembled in terror. The gods watched, some with awe, others with dread, for they knew when Achilles was enraged, he ceased to be human. He became a storm. He cut through the Trojan ranks like fire consuming dry straw. He fought not for glory, but for the bitterness of loss. Not for Agamemnon, but for Patroclus. He drove the Trojans back to the city walls, mercilessly killing all in his path. He even engaged in battle with the river god Xanthos, who tried to drown him in anger at the mountains of corpses choking his waters. Even the gods had to pull Achilles from the raging torrent. And finally, he met Hector. That epic duel will be told in the next chapter, for it deserves a separate narrative. But for now, let's return to Achilles' tent. Where once he had brooded in silence, he now thrashed in fury. His hands, once idle, now craved vengeance. His heart, once filled with pride, now burned with sorrow. Achilles' rage was not just war. It was the embodiment of the unbearable weight of loss, the helplessness of watching someone you love die, and realizing that it is partly your fault. He had left the battle to prove his point, but now that point cut too deep. Achilles had returned to the war, but this was no longer a campaign for honor or pride. This was a funeral in motion. There are moments in ancient myths when the clangor of war fades, when the spears, the galloping horses, and the shouting crowds dissolve, and we are left with only a profound silence. And in that silence, something ancient and deeply human stirs. Grief. This is one such moment. The war still rages, Greek warriors still die, Trojans still bravely defend their city, but all of it, for the briefest time, becomes merely a backdrop to the sorrow of one man. Achilles had just lost Patroclus. To many, Patroclus was merely a companion, his second in command, his loyal friend. But to Achilles, he was far more. A tether, a conscience, a reminder that life was more than blood and bronze. Their bond was unusually deep, forged not just in the harsh trials of war, but in laughter, shared memories, and those quiet hours when no one was watching. Some traditions assert they were lovers. Others say they were brothers in spirit. But what all texts agree upon, what Homer sings without ambiguity, is that Achilles loved Patroclus more than anyone else in the world. And when that love was taken from him, so too was everything that held Achilles in balance. Let's start with the death itself. Patroclus donned Achilles' armor, led the Myrmidons into battle, and drove the Trojans from the Greek ships. For a moment, it worked. The Trojans genuinely thought Achilles had returned. Panic swept through their ranks, but Patroclus, emboldened by success, forgot the warning Achilles had given him. Do not go to the gates. He went anyway. And there, beneath the high walls of Troy, he was struck down. First by Euphorbus, then by the hand of fate itself, and finally by Hector, Prince of Troy, who delivered the killing blow. Hector stripped the famous armor from Patroclus's body, still unaware of his identity, and claimed victory. But then, dying on the ground, Patroclus spoke. He told Hector that Achilles would come, that his death would not end the war. It would only begin it. And so it did. In the Greek camp, Achilles waited, still aloof, still resentful, still refusing to fight. And then the dreadful news arrived. Accounts vary as to who informed him. In some traditions it was Antilochus, Nestor's son, gasping with grief. In others it was a chorus of surviving warriors. But the result was the same. Achilles collapsed. He fell to the ground, covered his head with dust, and screamed. It was the cry of a man wounded not in the flesh, but in the very soul. A wail that shook not only the tents, but the gods themselves. His divine mother, Thetis, rose from the depths of the sea. She knew even before he spoke, and he told her, I must return to war. I must kill Hector. I must avenge Patroclus, even if it means my own death. For Achilles now understood something terrible. His fate was sealed. The choice he once had, a long life or short glory, was no longer his. Patroclus was dead, and there was only one road left. But he could not walk it just yet. First he had to bury his friend. The Greek warriors, with immense difficulty, retrieved Patroclus's body. Hector and the Trojans, eager for the armor and glory, tried to reclaim it. but Ajax and Menelaus, among others, bravely fought them off. Achilles himself appeared on the battlefield, unarmed, roaring so loudly that the Trojans recoiled in terror. His mere presence turned the tide of battle. Then Thetis, ever the caring and beautiful mother, went to Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. There, in the forge of divine flame, new armor was wrought. Brighter, stronger, more terrible than before. The centerpiece was a shield, so intricately made that it contained the entire world. Cities in peace and war, farmers in fields, lovers dancing, stars spinning overhead. It was a reminder, even to Achilles, that there was more to life than revenge. But he put it on anyway. And then there was the funeral. In Homeric culture, burial rites were sacred. To die without proper ceremony was to wander the underworld in misery. Achilles vowed not just to bury, but to honor Patroclus. They built a massive and solemn pyre. Sacrifices were made, including a horrific 12 Trojan captives, whom Achilles slew in Patroclus's name. Whether it was grief or rage, it's hard to say, but it was grim and deeply telling. There were games too. Chariot races, boxing, spear throwing. These were not distractions. These were acts of remembrance. For the Greeks, excellence in sport was a way of touching the divine. Even in death, Patroclus would be surrounded by honor. Then came the moment Achilles placed a lock of his own hair in Patroclus's hand. A small but devastating gesture, he whispered promises, and the pyre was lit. Smoke curled into the sky, ascending like a soul. And somewhere in that long twilight between myth and memory, Patroclus passed into legend. But Achilles did not find peace. He found rage. He turned his gaze to the walls of Troy, to Hector. Now, in fairness, Hector had killed Patroclus not out of malice. He was defending his city. He had no idea who was inside the armor at first. But such subtleties do not survive grief. And so Achilles returned to the war. He moved like fire. He killed without cease. He hunted the Trojans like animals. He defied the gods, even Xanthos, Troy's river god, who begged him to stop choking his waters with corpses. Achilles refused. And when the river rose in wrath, trying to drown him, it took the intervention of Hera, Athena, and Hephaestus, wielding flame against flood, to pull Achilles out. Even the gods could barely contain him. And then, at last, Hector and Achilles met. It was not a skirmish, not a chance encounter on a bloody field. It was the prophesied duel, long awaited and deeply personal. Hector waited outside the gates, knowing this moment had to come. He stood not just for Troy, but for every man who fights because he must, not because he wants to. When Achilles arrived, Hector's courage faltered. He ran. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy. Achilles pursued, Hector fled, until at last Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, tricked him into standing his ground. The 2 warriors faced each other, and the battle was swift. Achilles killed Hector, plunging his spear into his neck. But death was not enough. In one of the most brutal acts of Homeric poetry, Achilles tied Hector's body by the ankles to his chariot and dragged him through the dust around the walls. Not once, but again and again. It was a desecration, a defilement. A man of Hector's nobility deserved better, but Achilles was beyond mercy. He dragged the body back to camp, threw it beside Patroclus's pyre, and left it to rot. For days the Greeks were silent. Even the gods were disturbed. Then unfolded a scene imbued with true wonder. King Priam, already advanced in years, ravaged by grief and utterly unarmed, managed to penetrate the Greek camp, guided by none other than the messenger of the gods, Hermes himself. He entered Achilles' tent, where, kneeling, he kissed the hands stained with his son's blood. His plea was not the demand of a monarch, but the heartfelt cry of a father. And Achilles, struck by this profound sincerity, could not hold back his tears. Looking at Priam, he seemed to see through him his own aged parent, Peleus. In that moment, his own future, his destiny, his inevitable loss, were revealed to him. He raised the old man, offered him food, shelter, and even comfort. In the silence that fell between them, there was an almost sacred connection. They shared a meal. They spoke of fathers, of children, of those things no poem can fully convey. After this, without further ceremony or haggling, Achilles returned Hector's body. Two men sat face to face, not as sworn enemies, but as fathers mourning their dead sons. For one precious moment the war stood still. There were no trumpets, no battle cries, only a profound silence. Hector was buried. A huge funeral pyre was erected. His wife, Andromache, mourned him with inconsolable grief. His mother, Hecuba, shed bitter tears. Even Helen spoke farewell, calling him the only man in Troy who never reproached her. This served as a vivid reminder that even in war, kindness resonates far more powerfully than conquests. Thus, the defender of Troy passed into eternal memory. And Achilles? He now recognized the approach of his own death, but for the first time, it did not matter to him. He had done what needed to be done, not in the heat of battle, but in an act of mercy. This was his transformation. Achilles began his journey as the embodiment of rage, untamed pride. And here, for one brief moment in history, he becomes something else. Not just a warrior, not a son of prophecy, but a man who felt the depth of another's grief and chose compassion. The tide of fate had turned, not because the Greeks had achieved a military victory, but because their greatest hero had demonstrated. War is not always triumph. Sometimes it is simply survival. Sometimes it is the ability to let go. Troy still stood proudly. Yet its walls now seemed thinner, less impregnable. The gods no longer rent the heavens with their cries. And Achilles, that brightest yet most fleeting flame, stood on the very edge of his destiny. The next arrow had already left the bowstring. By this time, the sands beneath Troy were amply soaked with the blood of countless victims, but the city still held. Heroes came and went, each leaving their mark on this eternal saga. Gods chose sides, changed their minds, and at times even descended into the thick of battle themselves. The greatest warrior Hellas had ever known had returned, avenged his fallen comrade, and for a short time found a measure of inner peace. But the end, that distant yet inexorable thunderclap, was growing louder and closer, and now the war was preparing for its final, decisive turn. Achilles was still on the battlefield, still terrifying, still miraculously alive, but this would not last long. Let us now turn to his death, not because it was unexpected, but because, as is often the case in Greek myths, it was horrifyingly predictable. The gods, and especially Apollo, had not forgotten what Achilles had done to Hector. Apollo watched as the body was dragged, as the sacred code of burial was violated, as rage exceeded all mortal limits. Therefore, when the time came, he aided the most improbable figure, Paris. Paris was not a hero in the traditional sense. He was a lover, a charming man, a prince with handsome features but prone to extremely ill-fated decisions. However, under Apollo's divine guidance, he took up a bow, and as Achilles, blazing with triumph, carelessly approached the Scaean gates, Paris released an arrow. Some chroniclers claim the arrow struck his heel, the only vulnerable spot Thetis could not protect when she dipped him in the waters of the Styx. Others say it was the hand of a god that imbued the arrow with deadly force. In any case, the result was the same. Achilles fell. There were no grand speeches, no slow-motion goodbyes, just the fall of a man who had burned too brightly for too long. The Greeks plunged into mourning, and then, predictably enough, began to argue over who would inherit Achilles' armor. They were unsurpassed in the world, forged by Hephaestus himself, gleaming with divine artistry. Two claimants emerged, Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, mighty, straightforward, and fiercely loyal, and Odysseus, son of Laertes, cunning as a deity, and twice as persuasive in his speeches. A contest was held. The Greeks listened intently to their arguments. Ajax spoke of heroic deeds and the strength of arms. Odysseus spoke of strategy and wisdom, and in the end, the armor went to the man who could turn words into formidable weapons. Odysseus. Ajax was broken. He had fought valiantly, carried Achilles' body from the field, stood firm when others faltered, and now he was passed over in favor of an eloquent tactician. His honor, so long tied to his invincible strength, crumbled. In the deep dark of night, Ajax lost his mind. He slaughtered sheep, mistaking them for his enemies. When sanity returned and he saw what he had done, he took his own life, falling on his own sword. Thus another hero perished, not in battle, but in the depths of despair. The Greeks quietly burned his body. Even then, suicide remained a complex matter. Honor and shame were forever intertwined in this tragedy, and Troy still stood. By this point, the war had become a tragic theatre, with each hero falling in turn. The gods began to withdraw, perhaps embarrassed by what they themselves had helped create. The Greeks turned to prophecies, which is always the last resort when all other means fail. According to the seers, 3 conditions had to be met for Troy to fall. First, Achilles' son had to fight beneath the walls of Troy. Second, the Greeks had to retrieve the bow of Heracles. Third, the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena, had to be removed from Troy. All so simple, wasn't it? And so they went in search of Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, also known as Pyrrhus. Raised far from the fighting, he was young, untested, and full of that aggressive self-confidence only teenagers possess. When Odysseus found him, the youth agreed to join, not out of duty, but from a sense of inescapable destiny. He was to finish what his father had started. Next on the list was Philoctetes. Philoctetes was a sore point for the Greeks. Years earlier, he had been bitten by a snake on the way to Troy, and the wound festered constantly. The Greeks, never known for their sensitivity, abandoned him on the island of Lemnos. With him they left the bow of Heracles, the only weapon prophesied to bring down Troy. Truly, a charming story. Odysseus returned, full of apologies. Philoctetes, understandably, was furious. But after some persuasion and a promise of heroic atonement, he finally agreed. The bow returned to the war. The prophecy, piece by piece, began to unfold. The third task required stealth. The Palladium, a statue of Athena, served as Troy's unbreakable safeguard. As long as it remained in the city, Troy could not fall. Odysseus and Diomedes crept into Troy by night, climbed the walls, and stole it. No flashes, no fanfare, just two men accomplishing what entire armies could not. And now, at last, Troy was vulnerable, but it was still not defeated. And so it was time for cunning. The Greeks, led by Odysseus, constructed a wooden horse, a massive hollow structure cleverly carved to appear as an offering to the goddess Athena. They left it at the gates of Troy and sailed away, or so it seemed. The Trojans discovered it, confused, curious, and arguing. Some, like Laocoon, warned against it. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he uttered, before being quite dramatically devoured by sea serpents. The gods were not subtle with their hints. Others, like Sinon, a Greek left behind and pretending to be a deserter, told a story of sacrifice, of atonement, of the war's conclusion. The horse, he claimed, would bless Troy, and the Trojans, weary of war and full of hope, dragged it inside the city. A long night of revelry followed. After 10 years of siege, the Trojans finally had a long-awaited reason to celebrate. Fires were lit, wine flowed, songs were sung, and the people of Troy, tired but jubilant, believed the war was over. However, war, as wars tend to do, had one final act. During the night, the Greeks returned. From the belly of the horse emerged warriors, Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and others. They flung open the city gates. The Greek army, hidden on a nearby island, poured into the city. Chaos was instantaneous. Temples blazed, families fled in panic. The clang of bronze echoed in the narrow streets. Priam, the aged king, was slain at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus himself, an act that, even in the bloody economy of war, was considered monstrous. Hecuba, his queen, was taken captive, destined to spend the rest of her life as a servant in the house of her enemies. Andromache, Hector's widow, watched as her child Astyanax was thrown from the walls. It was a cold calculation, designed to prevent revenge from the next generation. Helen was reunited with Menelaus, though not without tension. Some accounts say he raised his sword and she simply dropped her garments. Old habits, as they say. But what of the victors? They had won, yes, but what had they truly gained? The city lay in ruins. Troy's treasures were loaded onto ships. The gods, once so actively involved, fell silent. And the Greeks, those who survived, began the long, uncertain journey home. Odysseus wandered for another 10 years. Agamemnon returned to a wife plotting his murder. Menelaus drifted through Egypt before returning to Sparta. The war was over. But the stories, their stories, were just beginning. Victory in Greek myth is never clean. There is always a price, a stain, a reckoning. And the horse remained, not as a relic, but as a symbol, a reminder that in the end, It was not brute force that ended Troy. It was a story of deception, of cunning, of a long game played by a man who could lie to a goddess and get away with it. If Achilles represented the peak of heroic rage, Odysseus embodied the cunning the Greeks called metis, not just trickery, but strategic wisdom, the kind that hides a blade behind a smile, the kind that ends wars not with a roar, but with a whisper. And so, as fire licked the rooftops and history closed its book, the Trojan War came to an end. The cost was destruction, the reward was songs. Songs sung through the ages of rage, of love, of cities burned and legends born. And the war, though ended, would echo in Ithaca, in Rome, in every story where pride meets fate and cunning topples kingdoms. But that, well, that is an entirely different story. The Great War had concluded, and yet, in essence, the conflict was by no means over. Mighty Troy had fallen. Its fortress walls, once considered impregnable bastions, crumbled, unable to withstand the perfidy of deceit and the all-consuming power of flame. The city streets lay buried under layers of ash and shrouded in deep sorrow. The bodies of both royalty and common folk lay lifeless beneath the ruins of burning palaces, erasing all social distinctions. The air was thick with acrid smoke, the scent of blood, and the feeling of a final collapse of something truly magnificent. However, for those who managed to survive, both Greeks and Trojans, the most difficult chapter was just beginning, and its name was consequence. Let us begin with the city itself. The sack of Troy was not merely a battle, but rather a complete dissolution, a chaotic destruction of established order. Once the wooden horse had delivered its ominous cargo within the city walls, once the gates were flung open and Greek detachments poured into the city under the cover of night, the violence lost all structure and organization. This was not a duel consecrated by martial honor or rules. It was unbridled chaos, blind vengeance, and the brutal, merciless culmination of a decade of unceasing fury. Priam, the venerable king of Troy, sought refuge at the altar of Zeus, a sacred place. There, surrounded by symbols of piety and hope for divine protection, he offered pleas for mercy. However, he found no mercy. Neoptolemus, the son of valiant Achilles, struck him down without the slightest hesitation. Thus the holy altar was defiled with blood, and the old order collapsed forever. Hecuba, Priam's wife and queen of Troy, was taken captive. She was destined to spend the rest of her days as a servant in the house of her bitterest enemies. Her transformation from sovereign to slave, from a living symbol of Troy's grandeur to an emblem of its complete desolation, was not unique. Many women of Troy shared this tragic fate. Andromache, Hector's faithful wife and mother of Astyanax, was also enslaved. Her son, however, fared even worse. The Greeks, fearing that he might one day grow up and rise to avenge his father, mercilessly threw him from the high city walls. In the ancient world, such actions were considered both pragmatic and undoubtedly horrifying. Hector's lineage was completely extinguished. The fates of the Trojan women were reflected and immortalized in later tragedies. Cassandra, the doomed prophetess, was forcibly dragged from the temple of Athena by Ajax the Lesser. She desperately clung to the goddess's statue, seeking divine protection, but no one came to her aid. Subsequently, she became Agamemnon's concubine, a prize he would, as it turned out, very soon regret. Helen, whose beautiful face, as myth claims, launched 1,000 ships, was finally found by Menelaus. Some traditions assert that he intended to take her life. Others tell that she uttered but a single word and allowed her garments to slip from her shoulders. In any case, she survived, and Menelaus took her home, for war, as always, proved far more complex and multifaceted than it initially appeared. Now, let us turn to the Greek side. They had achieved victory. The city was plundered. All the spoils belonged to them. And yet it was not a clean, unmitigated victory. Greek religion placed enormous importance on ritual sacrifices and proper pious conduct in the face of the gods. However, during the sack of Troy, these inviolable boundaries were grossly violated. Temples were desecrated and plundered, altars stained with blood, and sacred sites subjected to outrage. For these monstrous crimes, the gods were not going to remain silent. Storms immediately arose, foreshadowing impending calamities. The journey home for many Greeks proved far longer and more perilous than the war itself. Agamemnon, the supreme king, returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his own wife, Clytemnestra. She had not forgotten the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, offered to Artemis at the very beginning of the war to appease the goddess. And she, of course, did not miss the opportunity to share a bed with Aegisthus, her lover, in Agamemnon's absence. Cassandra perished with him, foreseeing the entire tragedy but powerless to prevent it. Menelaus and Helen were forced to wander the Mediterranean, eventually landing in Egypt. It took them many years to find their way back to Sparta, and even when they finally returned, the shadow of war never left them. Helen's reputation in later Greek thought was, at best, ambiguous. To some, she remained the embodiment of unearthly beauty and irresistible desire. To others, she served as the ultimate cautionary tale, a woman who brought entire empires to ruin simply by her existence. As for Odysseus, his story became truly legendary. The Odyssey recounts a 10-year journey marked by encounters with monsters, treacherous witches, seductive singers, and the indomitable wrath of Poseidon. Each episode of this epic wandering is rich with profound symbolism. The Cyclops Polyphemus embodies the dangers of untamed wild force. The sorceress Circe is the allure of comfort prevailing over duty. The sirens, in turn, symbolize knowledge without consequence. And yet, despite all his incredible trials, it is not brute force but cunning, unyielding endurance and restraint that bring Odysseus home. However, even he, a hero of countless twists and turns of fate, finds no easy welcome in his homeland. Penelope, his faithful wife, remains loyal but is surrounded by insolent suitors. His son Telemachus is almost grown. His palace is full of strangers who feast on his provisions and mock his name. Returning home is not a triumph. It is a complex reintegration. And it is never easy. This theme of the difficult return, known as nostos, became central to Greek literature. The war may have ended in Troy, but it lived on in the hearts of the people who fought in it, and it did not subside in the lands to which they returned. Memory, trauma, and the burden of legend remained with them. The Greeks knew well that victory had its price, and that price was often paid in silence, anxiety, and nightmares. The Trojans, however, had entirely different fates. Aeneas, Hector's cousin and one of the few surviving Trojan leaders, fled the burning city, carrying his aged father Anchises on his back and leading his son Ascanius beside him. Guided by prophetic visions and fate itself, he carried the household gods of Troy into exile. This was a story of survival, a story of cultural rebirth. His journey, immortalized in Virgil's great Aeneid, led him across the Mediterranean, where he faced storms, temptations and wars, until he finally landed in Italy. There, his descendants, as the Romans claimed, founded the great city of Rome. Thus, Rome was born, not in victory but in flight, not in conquest, but in the ruins survived. So, from the ashes of Troy, a new myth arose, a new narrative. One empire fell, and another, in turn, rose. The Greeks had their heroic epics, and the Romans, not to be outdone, created their own lineage, tracing their origins from the very ashes of their former enemies. History has an astonishing ability to twist so bizarrely. Archaeological evidence confirms that the city of Troy indeed burned around 1200 BCE. At the end of the Late Bronze Age, many cities in the eastern Mediterranean were destroyed or abandoned. The reasons for this large-scale collapse remain a subject of scholarly debate. Among possible versions are invasions, internal disintegration, climate change and disruption of trade routes. The so-called Sea Peoples, a mysterious force of destruction that left behind only smouldering ruins, were often mentioned in this context. But the burning of Troy fits into a much broader picture. Myth, perhaps, is a poetic creation, but its roots lie in a historical earthquake of civilization. This is how the Trojan War became something far greater than just a military conflict. It became a mirror, a way for later Greeks to reflect on the price of pride, on the complexity of human destiny, and on the fragility of civilization. It became a warning, clothed in epic form, and perhaps also a mournful lament. Tragedians would return to its characters again and again. Euripides gave voice to Hecuba, Andromache, and other women left in the ruins. Sophocles explored the tragic disintegration of Ajax. Aeschylus presented Agamemnon's return and the cursed legacy of his house. The war never ended. It merely changed form, moving from the battlefield to the theatrical stage. Through these plays, the war lived on, not as glory, but as grief. The true consequence was not victory, but memory, and the figures who once seemed immortal gained new dimensions. Achilles, fierce and doomed; Hector, noble and burdened by duty; Priam, the last light of a fading era; Odysseus, always ingenious, yet always lost. Their stories were retold, reinterpreted, and passed down from generation to generation. From Homer to Virgil, from scrolls to the stage, from ancient epic to modern screen. The Trojan War lives on because it speaks not only of ancient heroes, but of eternal human truths. Love and vengeance, loyalty and betrayal, fate and freedom. Because the Trojan War is not just a tale of clashing armies. It is a profound reflection on endings, on what happens when the fire goes out, and the survivors must learn to live in its light. The war ended with fire, but its echoes, its names, its questions, its sorrows never fell silent. So here, at the end of it all, we leave the ashes of Troy. The ships are gone. The gods have retreated. The heroes are dead or wandering. and the world somehow moves on. But somewhere in the background there will always be the horse and the city that trusted it.